Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series on Aristotle's Poetics. In this video we're going to be looking at Unities in drama. Now, the most important element of tragedy for Aristotle was the plot. With respect to plot, Aristotle is often said to speak of three unities: the unity of action, the unity of time, and the unity of place. However, these rules are not actually attributable to Aristotle, but rather to an inaccurate interpretation of his works by the French neo-classicists. While he does speak of the importance of the unity of action, he only briefly mentions the unity of time as more a description than a proscription, and is completely silent on the unity of place. However, before looking into the impacts of this misinterpretation, we must define what is exactly meant by each term. The quote-unquote minor unities are easy to define. The unity of time means that a play must take place over the course of 24 hours, though sometimes it's argued to be 12 hours due to the ambiguity of Aristotle's language of the single revolution of the sun. The unity of place means that the play must take place in a single location. Now, these ideas sound very cool and interesting in that all the action has to be done in 24 hours, it's in a single place. You might see why these are appealing ideas. However, these were not things that Aristotle really argued for in any big way. He did, however, argue for the unity of action. The principal unity that Aristotle actually discusses, and the only one that he takes as requisite for making a good tragedy, is the unity of action. By this he means that a play should focus on a single plot, a single reversible fortune from good to bad or bad to good. Everything in the plot should be essential to it, i.e. removing anything would make it disjointed. For Aristotle, tragedy is an imitative art. The thing that it is imitating is a single complete action. This is one of the things that distinguishes tragedy from epic poems, which often have multiple big actions and take a long time and are very long. Tragedy is about zooming in, focusing down on one single action that represents kind of the turning point of the story. Some people have described Greek tragedy and Greek theater as described by Aristotle as taking our normal conception of a story and zooming down to kind of the moment just before the climax, and the moment just after, not taking into account kind of the whole process of what was happening before, a turning point, the building to that final action. It's just this very zooming down on that single action and why it matters. There are some elements of Aristotle's ideas which have carried on to modern thought regarding theater. The principle of Chekhov's gun, the idea that if a gun is present in the play, it has to go off at some point, can be seen as being based on this principle. Basically, if the gun could be removed without damaging the plot, it should be. So, if you have any elements to a plot that are not essential to it, why are you including them at all? However, other elements of Aristotle's unity of action have fallen by the wayside. Many stories today have multiple interweaving actions, which are quite complicated, and may relate to each other but are importantly distinct. Much of Shakespeare's work does not conform to Aristotle's unity of action, having many different plot lines representing different actions that are going on. Aristotle briefly mentions the unity of time as a description of one of the distinctions between tragedy and epic poetry, not as necessarily a required element of a good tragedy. It's important to note that a lot of the things that Aristotle says can be interpreted as kind of ambivalent between this is what you should do and this is just what is done, but this leans more on the this is what is done side, whereas the unity of action leans more on the side of this is what you should do. He claims that tragedy attempts to limit itself to one revolution of the sun, which has been debated to refer either to a 12-hour period or a 24-hour period. Aristotle does not mention the unity of place at all in the Poetics, though some plays of the time did occur in a single place, so it might be understood as implicit in something that he said, though Aristotle was awfully explicit about a lot of things. So, anyone that's saying that Aristotle said the unity of place is probably on very, very shaky footing. Now, if Aristotle did not prescribe these minor unities, where did they come from? And why are they associated with Aristotle? The fault lies with the neo-classicists of France, starting in the mid-1600s. They advocated for rigorous adherence to the three unities, justified as, quote-unquote, classical by the claimed connection to Aristotle of theater, as well as the principles of bienséances and vraisemblance, basically following decorum and believable portrayals of events. Those could at least conceivably be pulled from some of Aristotle's principles about characters being virtuous, kind of having decorum, and being realistic or believable. So those principles you could at least pull out as Aristotelian. The unity of time and the unity of place, however, there's a lot more that is shaky in terms of whether Aristotle was proscriptive about those things, particularly place. These views on what theater should be held sway and were even enforced by strict censorship laws in France for over 100 years, influencing the works of greats such as Racine and Carneades, and were defended by Voltaire and Diderot against the English theater, which defied these rules, as evidenced by the popularity of Shakespeare, who very clearly had multiple plot lines, multiple actions, and stories that lasted sometimes long periods of time, and surely took place in many different places. Now, the rule of the neo-classicists was arguably brought to an end in the 1830s with the rise of Romanticism. In the theater, this is sometimes even traced down to a single event, the opening of Victor Hugo's play Hernani in 1830. The play outwardly flaunted the classicist rules of theater, and it even led to an open brawl between the Romanticists and the classicists in the audience during the performance, known as the Battle of Hernani. Think about that for a second, that a play could be so offensive to you not because of its content, but because of the way that the theater was done, that it didn't take place in 24 hours, and that it didn't have unity of action, and it didn't have some of these other things of the realistic portrayal and the virtue of the characters, that you would start fighting people in the audience over it. That is wild to me, and shows, in some ways, the power of rising up against kind of that censorship that existed in France at the time. Now, though censorship in France writ large would not be abolished for another 120 years, this event and the subsequent ousting of Charles X later that year led to the relaxing of France's strict adherence to the unities of drama. However, due to this long period of association of the unities with the Aristotelian conception of theater, these concepts were inextricably linked to Aristotle, despite his focus on really only one of them. Next up, we're going to be looking at Aristotle's ideas for the tragic figure. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.